For the next session today, we have another author who has penned a book about India and its corporate culture. Please welcome Aarti Kelshikar, founder of 3A Consulting and author of the book, How India Works, Making Sense of a Complex Corporate Culture. A specialist in human capital development, Aarti comes with over 15 years of international experience in training, coaching, and consulting. She is a certified facilitator of cultural intelligence and an accredited coach of the International Profiler. Today, as she joins us for Reprise, she will speak along the lines of the title of her latest book, How India Works, Making Sense of a Complex Corporate Culture. Following her keynote address, she will be joined by Sulakshna Mukherjee Mitra, GM and Head of Corporate Communications at McDonald's India, for a fireside chat.
Okay, hi everybody, hi again. Okay, and so, okay, I'm just going to begin soon. But, when people overseas talk about India, the two things that they usually say is IT and IST. I'm not going to talk about either because I think they've been stereotyped and generalized a fair bit. What I will do today is share 3 insights on how Indians are perceived, and as people from the PR communications community, I'm sure you'll appreciate the relevance that credibility makes a big difference and has a ripple effect on industries and success and productivity and all of those things. So in the world of cultural anthropology, there are a lot of differences in terms of how cultures differ. In that space, there's been a lot of work done by anthropologists, and these are called dimensions of culture. So you could have hierarchy, you could have communication styles, you could have the approach to risk. In this case, I've shown 2. One is, of course, hierarchy. The other is how people queue, which I thought may be interesting. So there are different styles and different ways in which people communicate. It's not good, it's not bad, but it is the way it is. Now, one of the styles that impacts working, when you're working across cultures, is the focus on structure and planning. In some countries, such as Germany and Singapore, there's a huge focus on structure and process. So they have plans that are chalked up months in advance, and then they have a step-by-step methodology and timeline to kind of achieve those plans. In other countries, plans may be made, but they're not always followed fully. Yeah. In India, they have what I call the 80-20 rule, which is like 80% of the work gets done in the last 20% of time, right? So a lot of times, they just wing it, right? And there's a lot of pride in it. And while people say that, the planning is poor, the process is unstructured, yes, that is true. But what is the upside to it? I think there are a lot of upsides in terms of the one and only jugaad. The other piece is the flexibility that we have, which is so good in today's VUCA world. But what I think really sets apart India from so many other cultures is the ability to handle and manage ambiguity. So I realized that firsthand when we were living in Southeast Asia, and we, when you were communicating and interacting with people, and you realize there's such a huge need for clarity, and people want you to break it down to the smallest little detail. There is no interest in interpreting things or in imagining things. Everything has to be black and white. And I think Indians really excel in the gray. And going forward, yeah, sure, could we do a bit more of structure and process? Yes. But I think one thing that really works well for us is the ability to handle ambiguity, especially in a VUCA world. So I'll tell you this incident where I was doing a training program for a Singapore-based company that was working in India. And I was telling them that maybe sometimes it's good to have a plan B, with India, because a lot of people feel that need given the uncertainty in government regulations and markets, etc. So at the end of it, when I asked them to summarize the takeaways, they said, no, not just a plan B. We want a plan C and a plan D. And again, that's Singapore for you, right? I mean, they really want it to be very precise and very, by the book. Okay, so the other piece is about different cultures build trust differently. Okay, in some cultures you have, trust is built from, is my work good? Is the quality of my work good? Is it timely? Is it consistent, right? I see my work is good, you trust me. It's cognitive, it's from the head. In other places, it's about, I am your friend, we connect together, we have tea, we bond together. It's from the heart, yeah? And then we'll begin to kind of, do work, right? So I'm not trying to say that India is on one extreme, because we're not. I think we're a mix of cognitive and affective. But I think the point here is that it's very important to know who are you dealing with. Who is your customer, your partner, your client? Where are they on this spectrum? And then to adapt accordingly. Yeah? I'll give you an example of Vanitha Narayanan, who used to head IBM in India and in Southeast Asia. One of the most versatile and one of the most humble leaders that I have met. And she talked about how when she was heading Southeast Asia, when she was heading ASEAN, she didn't have a one-size-fits-all approach. She said that when I went there, although I was the boss, I didn't approach those markets saying, oh, I'm the boss who's come into town and I know it all. She said that I looked at it like, okay, I won't ever know the reality of your ground situation. What I can do is help you and support you in any way that I can. Yeah? So she had different strategies. With the Koreans, for example, she tried to focus on technology and her expertise. She said she had more client lunches and dinners than she'd ever had in her entire life with Indonesia, Philippines, and Malaysia. Yeah, because that's how trust was built there. Yeah? And another very important point is that she said that I never made promises that I could not keep. Okay? And this sounds like, okay, what's the big deal in it? But so often one is heard of people just saying, yeah, I'll do it, of course. But you're then held to that standard. You're then accountable for that. And when you don't deliver, that's a sign that you cannot be trusted subsequently. So it's really a derailer with a lot of cultures. And I think it's something that we really need to be cognizant of. Yeah? So, in fact, in my research for the first book, which is How India Works, one thing that was a common challenge across almost all the leaders that I interviewed was the yes and no syndrome, right? Where, to manage the yes in India, where people will say yes and then not deliver, right? So I think we need to be more cognizant of it. We need to weigh our words. On the flip side, this, of course, works both ways. When people from overseas come and visit India, they need to be aware that it cannot just be a transactional thing. It can't just be about come in, I'll do my work, I'll tick the boxes, and I'll take the flight out in the evening, right? It's very important to make that connect with employees, with the client, with the partner, with whoever, right? I mean, as I've always mentioned, it's about drinking the chai and having the biscuit with people, investing in that, because that's what works in India, yeah? So you have to be cognizant. Leadership is contextual. You have to be able to adapt, yeah, both ways. So when I used to work in Singapore in a multicultural team, what I noticed was that it was very difficult for people to open up and say what they wanted to say. You will have a Chinese or a Singaporean guy or woman making one point in one meeting or one point in 3 meetings, whereas the Indian has a lot to say. It may not necessarily be on point. It may not be anything to do with the topic, It may not be research-led. It may not have anything to do with data points. Yeah. So how they're perceived then is that, okay, they are intelligent. They want to show they're the smartest people in the room. And they're not always succinct, you know. So these are some of the perceptions. Again, at the risk of stereotyping, not everybody is like this. But this happens often enough, as we have seen. But now let me give you a contrary view, a positive view in terms of how Indians are seen. There was this German leader I interviewed in my book. His name is Ryan. And he said that, so he had lived in 3 countries, Germany, Korea, and India. He said that in Germany, in meetings, there's a lot of discussion, there's a lot of analysis, people will challenge you every step of the way. Yeah, they're looking for consensus, but they're also looking to analyze and, you know, kind of get to it. Then you have Korea, which is completely on the other side. If the boss says go right, even if the decision should have been to go left, everybody will follow the boss and they will go right. He says that in India, it's a nice in-between. You have the hierarchy, people will listen, people will follow the leader. But you will also have people sharing their views, sharing their feedback, sharing their analysis. Also, I mean, provided that they feel comfortable, right? Again, this is to do with the culture of the team and the leadership team and all of that. But oftentimes you'll have people sharing their views, which is a very key point for success, right, in Asia, because not all Asian countries are similarly communicative, expressive, or articulate. If you're coming in new, it's important to be able to get a sense of the reality on the ground. And Indians are great at expressing themselves, as we know. So there are 2 sides to the coin. Yeah. Finally, in the interest of time, so this is how do you make sense of different cultures? And a tool that I have found useful is called CQ. It's not rocket science. It's not jargon at the same time. What it basically involves is a 4-step framework, which basically says that, okay, let's understand, let's go below the iceberg, understand what are the values. If you remember my first slide where I showed you, hierarchy and equality or, some of these differences, how are cultures different on certain metrics, on certain spectrums, and what can we do to kind of strategize to meet them somewhere in the middle so that we can be mutually successful, productive, and efficient. That's really the whole game. It's not something that's rocket science, but it's a huge tool to be able to enhance success and collaboration. And a lot of times, people realize this the hard way. Once collaborations have gone haywire, once a merger has just fallen by the wayside, and then people say, hey, we could have actually used a few cultural inputs, right? So it's important to be able to use the knowledge, be able to strategize, and come out with some tips, yeah? But the most important piece, according to me, in the whole thing is the first element, which is drive. Because a lot of times one can do the cultural training and one can talk about it till the cows come home. But if the person is not interested, if the person doesn't have the drive to make a difference, it makes no sense at all, right? And that's for everything we do. So I think drive is really the cornerstone of this whole thing to really succeed. And the other piece that I wanted to mention is that in today's world, leadership evolves, yeah? And as we get more adept at dealing with different cultures, also in our own country, right? We're talking about, we have North and South, to be simplistic, right? For example, I do talks in Delhi, I do talks in Bangalore. Is my approach the same? No, it's not. Because the way you build credibility and the way you focus on certain things cannot be the same, because culturally, the value systems are slightly different, even though we are under the Indian umbrella. So it's important to be able to be cognizant of that and important to be able to strategize so as to take your leadership to the next level. So you have IQ, you have EQ, and then you kind of have CQ, which is kind of the third wheel in this whole piece. With that, and given that my voice is the way it is, I'm going to now, follow this up with a Q&A with Sulakshna. Thank you.
So thank you so much, Aarti. I first thank you because you are not feeling well and you still made it so interesting. I'm already intrigued to, read your book. So maybe the first thing that I pick up like this night would be your book, for sure. While we were discussing, you mentioned an interesting quote from somebody to me, and you said that India is known as a land of 98%. In the interest of time, we could not discuss that. What is the relevance there, if you can tell us?
Yeah, so this was something that actually came up organically. Somebody mentioned this, and I thought it was interesting because I do see that, and I see that arguably more so in the younger generation. Again, don't mean to stereotype. So I'll give you an example. I was recently at a panel the other day, and there were two of us, and they had put up all these brochures digitally, etc. One of the panelists' names was wrongly, it was a spelling in the name, and that was visible everywhere. And in my case, it got the book name wrong. So it wasn't just a typo, that got the entire name wrong. And it's as they say, I think it's the little things are the big things. Yeah, so I think it's just one example. It's not about a poster or a book or in the larger scheme of things. But I do think culturally sometimes, because again, it's got to do with that whole, poor structure, poor planning, trying to cram it all at the end, and then not being able to do justice to, dotting the I's and crossing the T's. And in which case, the attention to detail, something's got to give. And I think at that point, something does give. I think we are great at 90 to 95%, but oftentimes we don't have the consistency to see through and to go to the final mile. And Jugaad is also a great example, right? I mean, you're able to do it, but there's usually, a consequence, a trade-off, right? Because it's a short-term fix. So I think that's something that we have to be cognizant of. But again, there's a dichotomy, right? Because if you look at creative arts, if you look at the field of embroidery or textiles or handicraft or whatever in India, there is such fine attention to detail. And then, in the corporate space, what happens, I don't know. So I think there is a dichotomy and something to be, kind of thought about. And also related to that is the point where I think it's important to do your homework, before a meeting, before a collaboration, before a deal, kind of finish it to the T and then kind of go ahead.
Yeah, absolutely. While they say what's in a name, but somebody recently told me that somebody's name is the most loved thing. They love to hear your name, as many times as you say. So Aarti, thank you so much. So on that, it comes credibility. And, when you were talking about various cultures, be it India, be it Southeast Asia, and the gray, black and white and all of that. And I know myself, being in McDonald's, I have to deal with the both. So, credibility essentially is very, very important for this room of full of people, of communicators, right? Whether it's about the credibility with your client, whether it's credibility with your leaders, your internal audience, with the media, et cetera, investors, and it goes on. How you said that it's important, to have attention to detail when it comes to building credibility. Does it differ across cultures? And also, how to figure that out, that, when it's your internal group of people, when it's external group of people, some things that people can keep in mind.
Yeah, I think credibility, I think there are a couple of things with this. I think one is that I mentioned earlier in terms of, what works with that particular group of people, right? In some cases, it's more about from the head. In some cases, it's more from the heart. But regardless, I think there's some things that are a given, right? Which is the quality of your work, the timeliness of your work, the consistency of your work. Indra Nui is famously known to have always gone well prepared for every single meeting. In fact, I had spoken to somebody who had worked with her very closely, and he mentioned that Indra, even in her final days when she was, on the PepsiCo board, she never ever came for a meeting without being fully prepared, which is really something, because at that level, you don't really have to prove anything to anyone, right? So I think those are a couple of things. Having said that, I do think that it may not be so much about culture, but it is certainly about gender. I think women are sometimes looked at differently in terms of credibility. Whether I know of an example where somebody was, didn't have the personality, looked, quite petite, and people would remark, okay, does she have the experience, does she have the expertise to be able to lead in this particular environment? I know somebody, a friend, her name is Abanti Sankaranarayanan, she's now with Mahindra Group, but earlier she was with Diageo, the alcohol beverages company. And she said that oftentimes, people would ask her, Madam, do you drink alcohol? And she was like, we're here to discuss work. I'm sure he wouldn't ask the same thing of a guy, So the starting point is often different for women. What you can do is to develop an outer thick skin, shrug it off, and say, okay, let me get this conversation back, on work, and let me show you what I'm really made of. And, so that I think there's no substitute for the expertise, for the work. A question to ask is, how can I really add value to me, to my work, to the team, to the organization? Just do the best you can.
It's also about a lot of practice, it comes naturally to some people, and that's why how leaders are, they're made of. And they typically have seen leaders practicing a lot, coming extremely prepared while they have nothing to lose because they are already at the top. But they are extremely diligent about these things. When we talk about CQ, what are some daily, practical tips that all of us can follow, especially communicators, before walking into a meeting, before giving a thought out, or before engaging with a stakeholder? IQ, EQ, we understand, and there comes the CQ. Are there daily practical tips that people can pick up from, and one at a time?
Okay, so one is, I would say, I think we all have biases, conscious, unconscious. I think, try and be more open to understanding more and to try and reduce those biases. I mean, today we're all talking about DEI and inclusion and belonging, and I think it's very important to have more sources of information. Chivanand Adichie, in this TED Talk of hers, talks about the danger of a single story. And I think that's so true, because if you only hear one story and one narrative, that's the only thing that's going to shape your mind, whether it's about Africa and, education or poverty, or whether it's about India or China or whatever. So I think that's important to kind of educate and learn from different sources, whether it's conversation, whether it's books, whether it's forums like these. So I think being open, yeah. The second piece would be to use, one of the framework is really about being able to strategize. So being able to anticipate, what can go wrong and kind of address that. I think that's a piece that's really key. And I'm sure even, in your communication meetings at McDonald's or whatever, that's something to kind of just keep in mind. It's not rocket science. Just kind of say, okay, how can I plan for this? How can I anticipate? How can I strategize? And how can I make sure that things go to plan? The other piece is about code switching, which is something very close to my heart. It's really about, the way I look at it, CQ is really about building a repertoire of skills so that you're able to work and adapt in different cultural contexts, right? So how can you, kind of be more effective in a situation like we are in right now, vis-a-vis one which may involve something different, So there is a time to be decisive and lead from the front. There's a time to be more in the background and be quiet perhaps and let someone else do the talking. I think there is a time to be more visible and vocal. There's a time to be more, indirect, sometimes to be more direct. So kind of reading the cues and reading the code and figuring out from your repertoire of skills that, okay, what can I use here that will be effective today? I think that's an evolved skill that happens, And you mentioned practice, and I think that happens with practice. You know, the more you do it and the more observant you are and the more you pick and take from people around you.
The last one would be that, all these cues are behavioral, right? And there's a lot of inner work that you have to do when you have to be there, especially understanding culture and building credibility there. We all fight crisis in an organization, and especially PR is now reputation management, right? So, is there any behavioral cue or attitude to adapt, to especially during a crisis when processes go haywire, so that you have that credibility and people trust you that moment with the decision?
Something that I have seen, and especially in, through my experience and conversations that I've had with different leaders across, what I feel is that transparency and clarity, I think these are the two things that really make a difference in a crisis, right? Being clear that, okay, I don't know how this is going to pan out, but how can we move forward the organization? How can we get everybody to be aligned and to understand that there are steps to follow and that we will see through this? And to also have consistent and timely communication, I think that's very key. I think something that took place in COVID was, showing vulnerability as a leader, because you didn't know what was going to happen, and a lot of leaders said, hey, we don't know where this is going, but maybe we can all kind of, take cues from each other and learn and pick ourselves together. So I think there's a time and place, of course, to show vulnerability, but I think sometimes it helps in a crisis. So I think these are a couple of things that really help, in terms of just having that right attitude, being transparent, being genuine, being authentic, Finally, everybody can see through that.
Absolutely, being authentic, and I guess communicate. Thank you so much, Aarti. Thank you for being with us today. Thank you.